The Germans also launched a scorched earth policy. Factories, power plants, railways and bridges were all blown up. A massive hydroelectric dam, which provided electricity for the whole of the Ukraine, was wrecked. Meanwhile, in the center of the front, the Germans fell back across the river Dnieper. As they fled, they blew up yet more bridges, turning the river into a formidable defensive line. They then dug in along the west bank. Stalin's response was to offer the Soviet Union's highest award to the first Red Army soldier to cross the river. By the early autumn 1943, a number of small Soviet bridgeheads had been established on the German-controlled West Bank. But they met determined German resistance. Fighting raged along the Dnieper throughout October 1943. Finally, at the beginning of November, Soviet troops captured Kiev. All along the river, the Germans were pushed out of their defensive positions and forced to retreat still further west. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had virtually cleared the Germans out of Russia's historic homeland. They were now moving west, across the Ukraine. The countries of Europe were in their sights. By spring 1944, Hitler's armies were in full retreat. The Soviet leadership now poured in ever greater quantities of men and equipment. The Germans had two excellent tanks, the Tiger I and the Panzer Mark V Panther. Both were well suited to the sort of mobile defensive warfare which was the only remaining hope for the German armies on the Eastern Front. But the Red Army had at least twice as many tanks, mostly the battle-tried T-34, and armament factories in Siberia were turning out more at a rate of 2,000 a month. While Hitler was forced to divide his forces between a war on two fronts, Stalin's war machine was working flat out. 6 million Soviet troops faced less than 3 million Germans. In early January 1944, the forces of the First Ukrainian Front moved in from the north on the German-held town of Korsun. It was the last German toehold on what they'd hoped would be their defensive line along the river Dnieper. 12 days later, the forces of the Second Ukrainian Front drove forward on the southern side. The attack followed a by now well-established Soviet pattern. First, there was a build-up of an overwhelming number of troops. The Germans were never quite sure where the first assault would come from. Then there was a devastating artillery bombardment. Next, the massed tanks of the Red Army would punch a hole through the German defenses. Finally, the infantry poured in. In Korsun, it quickly became obvious to the Germans they were about to be overwhelmed. The German commander, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to beg, yet again, for permission to pull out. But Hitler once more refused. After a week of fierce fighting, about 60,000 men were trapped in what became known as the Korsun pocket. The Soviets called it Little Stalingrad. The German forces now attempted to break out. But the Russians were ready for it. T-34 tanks and Cossack horsemen harried the Germans as they tried to escape. The fighting lasted 2 days.